1930. The world economy is sinking. In the United States, industrial production falls by a third. Unemployment reaches 25%. In Germany, 6 million people out of work. In Great Britain, entire industrial cities paralyzed. Orthodox economists say be patient. Markets will adjust. Wages will fall, prices will fall, and equilibrium will return. Just wait. A British economist, sitting in his office at Cambridge, looks at the numbers and thinks something nobody dares say out loud. What if markets do not adjust? Do we wait while millions of people starve? John Maynard Keynes was not a revolutionary. He was the son of a Cambridge professor. He went to Eton. He was elitist, brilliant, arrogant, and deeply pragmatic. And in 1936 he published the book that changed the relationship between governments and the economy forever. So far we have seen schools that trusted markets. The classicals said markets tend toward equilibrium. The marginalists gave them mathematical tools. The Austrians argued that no planner can outperform the wisdom of the market. Keynes did not deny any of these ideas entirely. What he said was more subtle and more devastating. They are right in the long run. But in the long run, as he himself wrote, we are all dead. The problem is not whether markets adjust eventually. The problem is what happens in the meantime. Classical economics, from Say to the Austrians, assumed that supply creates its own demand. If you produce something, you generate income, and that income gets spent. There may be temporary imbalances, but the system corrects itself. Keynes said, no. Not always. There are moments when people decide not to spend. Not because they have no money, but because they are afraid. Consumers save out of caution. Businesses do not invest because they see no future demand. Banks do not lend because they do not trust they will be repaid. When everyone saves at the same time, something paradoxical happens. Individually, saving is rational. Collectively, it is disastrous. If nobody spends, businesses do not sell. If they do not sell, they lay people off. If they lay people off, people have less money. If they have less money, they spend less. And the vicious cycle feeds on itself. Keynes called it the paradox of thrift. What is prudent for each individual can be catastrophic for society as a whole. That is aggregate demand. The sum of everything all consumers, businesses, governments, and foreign buyers want to spend. When aggregate demand falls, the economy contracts. And there is nothing in the market mechanism that guarantees it will rise again on its own. If the problem is that nobody is spending, Keynes's solution is logically straightforward: let the government spend. When the government builds a road, it pays workers. Workers spend their wages on food, clothing, rent. The shopkeepers, landlords, and farmers spend in turn. Each euro the government spends generates more than €1 of economic activity. This is the multiplier effect, originally developed by Richard Kahn, a student of Keynes. If the multiplier is 1.5, each euro the government spends generates €1.50 of total output. But the multiplier is not magic. It depends on circumstances. If the economy is already at full employment, public spending does not create new output. It only raises prices. And if people save the money instead of spending it, the effect is diluted. Keynes's critics also point to the crowding out effect. If the government spends more, it needs to borrow more. If it borrows more, interest rates rise. And if interest rates rise, private investment falls. Public spending can crowd out private spending. Both arguments have merit. The multiplier works best in deep recessions, when there are idle resources and interest rates are low. In boom times, its effects are much smaller. Keynes did not believe the economy was a clockwork machine operating according to predictable mathematical laws. He believed psychology matters as much as data. Entrepreneurs do not invest based on precise calculations of future returns. They invest based on what Keynes called animal spirits: optimism, confidence, intuition, instinct. When animal spirits are high, people invest higher and take risks. When they collapse, everything freezes. And no mathematical model can predict when they will change. Liquidity preference is another key idea. In moments of uncertainty, people prefer to hold cash rather than invest it. Cash earns no return, but it also causes no scares. When uncertainty is extreme, people hoard money. And the more they hoard, the less circulates. And the less circulates, the more economic activity falls. This leads to what Keynes called the liquidity trap. A situation in which interest rates are so low they cannot go lower. The central bank loses its main tool. Cutting rates to zero is useless if nobody wants to borrow. It is like pushing on a string. When monetary policy runs out of ammunition, only fiscal policy remains. The government as the spender of last resort. After World War II, Keynes's ideas dominated Western economic policy for nearly 30 years. Governments actively managed aggregate demand. They cut taxes and increased spending in recessions. They raised taxes and cut spending in expansions. The economy seemed tamed. And the results were spectacular. Between 1945 and 1973, the West experienced the greatest period of sustained economic growth in history. Low unemployment. Moderate inflation. Expanding middle classes. The welfare state. Some called it the golden age of capitalism. But in 1973, everything went wrong. The oil crisis produced something Keynesian theory could not explain well: stagflation. Inflation and unemployment at the same time. According to Keynes, inflation appears when there is too much demand. Unemployment appears when there is too little. They cannot coexist. But they did. And that opened the door to a counter-revolution. Keynes transformed economics. But his ideas are not invulnerable. First, public spending tends to be easier to turn on than off. Keynesian theory says the government should spend in recessions and save in expansions. In practice, politicians always spend. Nobody wins elections by promising austerity during good times. The result is a chronic accumulation of public debt. Second, the crowding out effect is real. Public spending can displace private investment, especially when the economy is not in a deep recession. Third, second-generation Keynesians oversimplified Keynes's ideas. They reduced him to adjusting the fiscal deficit like a thermostat. Keynes was much more sophisticated than that. He understood radical uncertainty, market psychology, the limits of knowledge. Many of his followers did not. Fourth, the stagflation of the 70s showed that the relationship between inflation and unemployment is not stable. The Phillips curve, which Keynesians used as a policy guide, broke. And that opened space for an alternative. But the criticisms do not nullify the fundamental contribution. Keynes demonstrated that markets can get stuck in equilibria with massive unemployment. That aggregate demand matters. That waiting for markets to adjust on their own can mean years of unnecessary suffering. And that governments have tools to prevent it. After the crisis of 2008, governments around the world returned to Keynesian prescriptions. After the pandemic of 2020, they did so on an unprecedented scale. Keynes's ideas remain alive because crises keep coming. When the crisis of 2008 hit, millions of people in Spain lost their jobs. Orthodoxy said, adjust. Cuts. Patience. Markets will adjust. They adjusted. Eventually. But in between, an entire generation watched its expectations evaporate. Unpayable mortgages. Evictions. Forced emigration. Keynes's question remains the fundamental question of economic policy: how much suffering are we willing to tolerate while waiting for markets to correct themselves? And is that suffering truly necessary? There is no easy answer. Spending too much can create inflation and unsustainable debt. Spending too little can destroy lives. The balance is difficult. But ignoring the question does not make it disappear. 3 ideas to take away from this episode. First, Keynes demonstrated that aggregate demand can be insufficient. When everyone saves at the same time, the economy sinks and does not recover on its own. The paradox of thrift shows that what is rational for the individual can be catastrophic for society. Second, the government can act as the spender of last resort through the fiscal multiplier. But this tool has limits: the crowding out effect, the political bias toward perpetual spending, and the difficulty of calibrating the right amount of stimulus. Third, the Keynesian consensus worked for 30 years and then crashed into stagflation. That does not invalidate Keynes's ideas, but it showed they are not a universal recipe. Like all tools, they work better in some circumstances than in others. Keynes dominated economics for a generation. Then came stagflation. And with it, a quiet professor from Chicago who had a very different explanation for the Great Depression. It was not a market failure, he said. It was a central bank failure. His name was Milton Friedman. Control the money, he said, and you control the economy. Leave demand alone. That, next time.